Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this installment of the Cape Perpetua Speaker Series. Today, we will be hearing from Max Nielsen-Pincus and Kaegan Scully-Engelmeyer on the public perceptions of coastal resources and marine protected areas. And our next installment will be on Saturday, January 8th, and we'll be hearing from Stephen Rumrill on Oregon shellfish in an acidified ocean. I'd like to acknowledge that the Cape Perpetua area landscape from Yachats to Florence is the traditional territory of the Siletz tribe and the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw tribe. And we want to acknowledge the tribal governments and their roles historically and today in taking care of these lands. And you can find out more about each of these tribes on their respective websites. A little bit about the Cape Perpetua Collaborative. My name is Tara Du Bois, and I'm the communications coordinator for the Collaborative. It's a pleasure to coordinate this series. And the Collaborative's vision is to foster conservation and collaboration within local communities for scientific exchange, management, awareness, and stewardship from the land and sea in and around the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve. And our three guiding principles are community engagement, leveraging resources, and engaging in partnerships. And at the bottom here, you can see a variety of logos. These are our founding partners who brought the collaborative together about 4.5 years ago. But in addition to these, we also have several local partners, the city of Yachats, local businesses and nonprofits. And I just want to acknowledge that without the help and support of all of our partners, this work wouldn't be possible. A little bit about the Marine Reserve. Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve is Oregon's largest marine reserve. And with the protected areas to the north and south, there's some form of protected waters that stretch between Yachats and Florence. An Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is the management agency that oversees the marine reserves and does the scientific research. We also host a variety of community science, and many of them are seasonal throughout the summer season, but we also host monthly beach cleanups. And then our BioBlitz series through iNaturalist is something that's ongoing and you can do on your own time, any time of year. So highly recommend connecting with that. We also host a Young Scientist webinar series, the second Tuesday of the month, October through April. And you can find out more information about all of our events, our presentations on our website at capeperpetualcollaborative.org. And you'll see there's an events tab that'll take you directly to a calendar. And I'd like to encourage you to connect with us on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. And if you like the work we're doing and you feel so inclined, you are welcome to donate. And on our website, there's a donate button at the top and the bottom, and you just can click that and it'll take you through the steps. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Max Nielsen-Pincus is an associate professor of environmental management at Portland State University. He received his PhD in 2007 in natural resource management from the University of Idaho's Department of Forest Resources and is an interdisciplinary scientist with a background covering both environmental and social sciences. Dr. Nielsen-Pincus's research focuses on the human dimensions of forests, watershed, and coastal management, and he is currently chair of PSU's Department of Environmental Science and Management. And today we are having a co-presenting. So we also have Kaegan Scully-Engelmeyer. He's a recent graduate from the Earth, Environment, and Society PhD program at Portland State University School of the Environment. He received his BA in Environmental Studies at University of Oregon in 2009 and worked for several years in natural resource management projects in Oregon, ranging from wetland conservation and management to endangered species recovery. His graduate research focused on landscape scale topics along the Oregon coast, including human dimensions of coastal and marine resources and connections between forestry management practices and freshwater estuarine aquatic communities. And with that, I will stop sharing, and Max, you can pull your screen up. And while they're pulling up their presentation, I just want to let you know, if any questions come up throughout, you are welcome to plug them into the chat or the Q&A box, and we will do a Q&A session after the presentation. And Max and Kaegan, turning it over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation to be here, and thank you all for joining us today. As you just heard, I'm Max Nielsen Pincus, an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Management at Portland State University, and the chair of the department. And my colleague here, Kaegan Scully-Engelmeyer, and I are going to talk a little bit about our work on public perceptions of coastal resources and marine protected areas. The title of our talk is Exploring Drivers of Support and Values for Oregon's Marine Reserves. And the work that we're going to talk about today is kind of exciting to do together. So I hope that you enjoy the little bit of trade-off that we get from going from one speaker to another. So with that said, let's just look. Oh, I got to press the right button. Let's just look at our agenda for today. And I'm going to try to rearrange my screen so that you guys are out of my way. Okay, excellent. So I want to start with just a very brief overview of some of the Marine Reserve work that's happened at PSU. And I guess I say that by putting my chair hat on in promoting the work that we're doing. And then we'll dive from there into my part of the talk, which will focus on the influences of support for marine reserves and marine reserve system growth. And then we'll shift gears and look at some of Kaegan's work looking at coastal values of Oregon residents in Oregon. And then we'll end with some discussion and takeaways from our work. So with that, let's look a little bit at just some of PSU and Marine Reserve work. So Portland State, through the Department of Environmental Science and Management, has been working with Oregon Sea Grant, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Marine Reserve Program, specifically on a variety of research around things like past and present tribal uses. So Sabra Comet, who is a PSU Masters of Environmental Management student who's now working with the South Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve, was looking at informing Oregon's marine protected area baseline by looking at past and present tribal uses. Bryn Hudson's work on effort shift in nearshore fisheries looked at both effort shift and familial succession among fishers in the nearshore to see if there had been any impact from the designation of marine reserves. And then the work that I'm going to present today is really around public perceptions of marine reserves or of marine protection and ocean health. And this work is a collaborative with Paul Manson, who is a Earth, Environment, and Society PhD student who now works at Reed College. And then Kaegan's going to talk about his work, which is recently published in the journal called Ecosystem Services, developing a participatory GIS mapping project that highlights indirect and existence values of coastal resources. And so that's what we have to look for. And I just learned this morning, thank you, that Kaegan, or this afternoon, that Kaegan is now working for the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. So there's a variety of folks who are working on marine reserve related research at Portland State University. And I guess I would also be remiss if I didn't mention my other collaborator, Elise Granick, who's probably the instigator of most of this work that I've just mentioned. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the project that Paul Manson and I and others worked on. That's looking at public perceptions of ocean health and marine protection, drivers of support for Oregon's marine reserves. So essentially, the basic question that this paper was published in Ocean and Coastal Management earlier this year. And the work is asking the basic question of whether Oregon's marine reserves are maintaining Oregon's public trust obligation. And through the paper, we develop a model to explore attitudes and beliefs that foster public support for or opposition to marine protections. And we draw on a variety of telephone survey data, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment to inform that model. But first, before we dive into the data itself, what is the public trust in coastal management? So if we look at the right, what's been written about this idea of the public trust, essentially it's the idea that we need to manage for general benefits, but also balance for specific uses that are required of those resources. So Sachs in 1970 in a seminal piece talked about how public resources have to be managed for the benefit of the general public by balancing those needs across many different users. And historically, I think in the ocean and coastal context, those users, those specific users that we're talking about, focused on traditional marine uses like navigation, commerce, and fisheries. But across Oregon and across the nation, and to some extent internationally, we've expanded those uses to include things like recreation, aesthetics, ecology. But as Sachs says, those often come with a more disorganized and diffuse majority as opposed to the sort of traditional users. A great example of the expansion of the public trust in Oregon is Oregon's 1967 beach bill, which made public access to all of Oregon's beaches. And I think therefore, expanded the public trust to include things like recreation and aesthetics in Oregon's coastal areas. So just looking at Oregon's marine reserves here a little bit so that we can all be on the same page. I suspect that you're here, you know a little bit about marine reserves, so I don't have to spend too much time on this. But Oregon essentially extended that public trust to marine conservation through the state's responsibility for conservation, maintenance, and enhancement of aquatic life, fish, and wildlife for present and future generations by establishing 5 marine reserves and 9 associated marine protected areas, including the 2 marine protected areas around Cape Perpetua and its marine reserve. Each reserve, as Tara mentioned a moment ago, has a management plan and has scientific monitoring that's associated with it. And Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is the lead agency for that. If you look at all 5, well, all 5 of the marine reserves and their associated protected areas across Oregon, they comprise about 9% of Oregon's territorial sea, or that area of ocean that's within about 3 nautical miles of the coastline. Whoops, hit the wrong button there. So just a little bit of background on support for marine reserves before we dive into our data. We asked the question on this slide of what do we already know about general public support and balancing those specific uses. And so we can look at a number of studies that have been published recently from Oregon that helps inform our understanding going into this research of what to expect. So Mark Needham's work in 2013 and 16 showed that almost 70%, over 2/3 of coastal residents, and about 90%, so the vast majority of I-5 corridor residents, would vote to establish marine reserves in Oregon. And remember, this was done right at the beginning of the marine reserve establishment. Jody Johnston's work looked at urban residents and found that they really defined marine reserves as something akin to what we think of or what we designate as terrestrial wilderness. So in the urban areas, people tended to think more of marine reserves like akin to wilderness. But at the same time, Tommy Swearingen and Beth Marino's work showed, that there are some negative attitudes about marine reserves and about the individual impacts, particularly in the commercial fishing sector. Yet Beth's work, as well as Bryn Hudson's work, showed that there was no sort of broad evidence that the establishment of marine reserves had actually led to effort shifts within the fisheries. And then finally, we can look at Craig Lindbergh's work, which showed that there was less than a 50% probability that coastal residents would choose expansion of marine reserves. But that choice in surveys was really influenced by the costs and the perceived impacts to fishing sector jobs. So those who didn't perceive impacts were more likely to choose expansion, whereas those who did perceive impacts were less. So our interest in our study was then to broaden all of these pieces of work that look at sort of narrow geographies or subsets of Oregon's population and look broadly across the state to say, how does Oregon's general public support for marine reserves vary across the state, and specifically vary by their awareness of the marine reserves, by where they live in the state, by what they perceive as threats to the ocean, and what do they see as accepted uses of the ocean. So what did we do actually? Well, we did a telephone survey. And so this was between March and June of 2016 with some then follow-up in March of 2017. We pulled a random sample of 3,365 landline and cell phone numbers, and then we screened people to make sure they were English speaking and that they had at least 12 months of residency in Oregon, so we could really consider our sample a sample of English speaking Oregon residents. The questionnaire, we did a bunch of pre-testing before we finalized what was actually going to be in the questionnaire, and finalized the mode to do the questionnaire, and ended up with a telephone survey. The questionnaire itself asked people about their awareness of ocean issues, their perceptions of ocean health, what uses they supported, and what threats they saw to the ocean. And then it asked specifically about things like the Oregon Marine Reserve System and their awareness of that system, as well as coastal visitation and some demographic issues like residency, income, as well as political party. And the questionnaire really ended with a question that asked them to gave them a scenario about increasing the number and size of marine reserves in Oregon, and asked them to essentially vote as to whether they would support a ballot measure that would increase the number and size of marine reserves in Oregon. So let's look at who responded to begin with. Out of those 3,365, I think it was, phone numbers, we actually made contact with about 2,272. We got about 459 participants. So this is about 20% response rate. Not my favorite response rate, but not all that different from fairly typical of telephone surveys. We did find that the population that we got to respond to our survey roughly matched the state population distribution. So we had about 69% of our sample came from the Willamette Valley, whereas about 72% of Oregon's population is in the Willamette Valley. We saw a little overrepresentation from coastal areas. So about 13% of our sample is from coastal areas, whereas only about half that is actually in the Oregon population, and a little underrepresentation from Eastern Oregon and Southern Oregon. But generally, I think the patterns held that we were able to get a distributed population across the state that matches the state population. We did see some biases that are typical in survey research. So our survey respondents tended to be older, more educated, and we had fewer, Hispanic respondents than what we would see in the population. Probably that last piece owing to the speaks English requirement. So our response summary, just to begin with, we had about 89% of our respondents said they had visited the coast within the last year, and about 13% were coastal respondents. When we asked them about, how informed they were about ocean and coastal resource issues, about 18% of our non-coastal respondents said they were very well informed or well-informed. So not, about 1 in 5 were only well or very well informed. Whereas of coastal residents, a much greater proportion self-reported feeling very well or well informed. When we ask specifically about marine reserves, that sort of sense of being informed goes down. So only about 5% of non-coastal residents expressed being well or very well informed about Oregon's marine reserves, whereas a little under a third of coastal residents did. And then when we look at that final question about voting to expand our marine reserves, we saw about 61% of non-coastal residents indicated they would expand. They would vote yes to expand marine reserves, and about 44% of non-coastal residents. And those other percentages have to do with the don't know responses. And overall, we saw 59% of respondents indicated that they would vote yes to expand Oregon's marine reserve system. We also asked about environmental threats to Oregon's oceans and coastal areas. So we had a 7-item bank of questions that asked about the threats to coastal and ocean health, and respondents were asked to rate each item on a strongly agree to strongly disagree scale. And we found that about 48 to 76% across these 7 items agreed or strongly agreed that say that each of the items were a threat to coastal health. So 48% agreed or strongly agreed that overfishing was a threat, whereas 76%, almost over three quarters, thought that marine debris was a threat to Oregon's coastal and ocean health. And we ran these 7 items through something called an exploratory factor analysis, and I'll save you the details, but basically it groups the items into groups, and we sort of think about the 2 different groups that came out of the analysis as a group of concerns that people have about ecological integrity, things like species loss, overfishing, habitat loss or degradation, as well as climate change. And then another group of things that people are concerned about having to do with pollution, marine debris, or introduced or non-native species that we describe as environmental quality threats. And finally, I think this is the last summary piece, that we look at acceptable coastal and ocean uses. So we saw a majority of support among all and among coastal respondents for uses of the oceans, including things like creation of areas that prohibit fishing, harvesting, or other human development, so a limitation use. A majority support for things like wind turbines in the ocean. Majority of support for things like wave energy, ocean agriculture, as well as desalination for drinking water. We saw more mixed support and opposition among a variety of other things. So things like commercial fisheries, where we saw about 44% of all respondents felt like or expressed support for commercial fisheries. If we look at our coastal group of respondents from the coastal region, that was a majority there, 56%. Similar pattern with shellfish farming, with a minority supporting shellfish farming across the state, but a majority of coastal respondents. And fish farming fish farming was actually a minority of all respondents and coastal respondents. Same with offshore oil and gas. So we took all of this data and we threw it into a big model that looked at the willingness of our respondents to vote to expand the Oregon's marine reserve system. And we developed something called a logistic regression model. And it was reasonably predictive, particularly for this type of data, of a respondent's willingness to vote for expanding Oregon's marine reserve system. And there ended up being 6 important variables that influences our respondents' willingness to, what they said they would, how they would vote on a proposal to expand the marine reserve system. And these had to do with things like perceived threats to the ecological integrity of the ocean, their perceived threats to ecological integrity. So the higher those threats were, the more likely they were to say they would vote to expand Oregon's marine reserve system. If they said they were in support of limiting human uses, not surprisingly, they also said they would vote to expand Oregon's marine reserve system. The more informed they were about Oregon's marine reserves, the more likely they would vote for to expand Oregon's marine reserve system. And then on the flip side, the last 3 were things that caused people or influenced or were related to people being less likely. So support for commercial fishing, no surprise there. That the more support people had for commercial fishing, the less likely they were to vote to indicate that they would vote to expand Oregon's marine reserve system. Republican Party affiliated respondents also said similar. And then coastal residents were also less likely to be willing to vote to expand Oregon's marine reserve system. Now, you may have noticed there's a couple of asterisks next to a couple of these. So informed about Oregon's marine reserves, as well as coastal residents and Republican Party affiliation as well. And one of the things that we see here is that when we look at the figure is that over on the right side of the diagram, so let's just look at informed on Oregon's marine reserves, you see a wider, what we call confidence interval for people who are really strongly informed. So if they rated themselves as being very well informed, there was a wider confidence interval on their support for voting to expand the Oregon's marine reserve system, which just indicates that for some of these items, we saw variability sort of at the extreme. So people who are really informed, some of them that made them even more interested in voting to expand Oregon's marine reserve system, and others that being really informed actually made them less likely to do so. We see the same thing here in coastal residents as well, where there's a pretty wide confidence interval down here, which says that there's some coastal residents who are really supportive of expansion and others that weren't. So moving on, key takeaways, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kaegan. So key takeaways. So first, just a reminder that the public trust doctrine, this doctrine that we held there, that we've applied to Oregon's marine conservation, has two obligations. One is general public support, and the second is to balance specific needs of users. So Oregon's marine reserves, I think we can say based on our data, have that general public support. It's driven by concerns for threats to the ecological integrity of our oceans, as well as support for limiting some of our human impacts to the ocean. But at the same time, there's room for improvement on addressing the concerns of coastal communities and the fishing industry specifically. And I think the marine reserve system evaluation that Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the state legislature is working on offers some room for engagement on how to make those improvements. And then finally, I would say, I think our study fits very well and tells a similar story to some of the studies that I previewed earlier. So the studies, there is some variability among them, but they all tell similar stories. And that story is essentially that there's generalized support for the Oregon's marine reserve system, but some coastal concern, and specifically within those allied with the fishing industry. And so those are things that I think we should address and work to evaluate and engage upon so that we can make sure that we meet that public trust obligation. And so with that, I just want to say thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Kaegan to talk about his work on the values Oregonians hold for the state's marine and coastal areas. So Kaegan, if you just want to tell me when to flip to the next slide, I'm happy to do that.
Okay, great. Thanks. Sounds good. Hello, everybody. So I'm going to talk about the portion of this project that I was a part of, which was the participatory mapping survey and subsequent analysis and reporting. And so what we did in this project, this portion of the project, was to explore values shared by Oregonians about Oregon's coastal and marine resources. And in our survey, because it was a mapping survey, was designed to capture those values in a spatial way. So looking at where on the coast people chose to place value pins. And so the specific objectives that we were setting out to answer were whether types of values and the location of where those values are placed of perceived importance along the coast, if those types and locations varied based on the respondents' home region, so where they lived in the state. We also were curious how survey respondent awareness and opinion about the marine conservation areas, the MPAs, and marine reserves influenced the types of values that were placed during their survey. And then finally, we were curious about whether marine value pins placed within the network, which was not designated or delineated during the mapping exercise, whether those values would differ from the coastwide average types of values that were placed. So next. And so in order to collect this information, we used an opt-in survey methodology. So this involved distributing a link to a mapping interface via networks and listservs and organizations posting on websites, things of that nature, to try to engage people in this mapping exercise. And we used a Google format, and within the web interface, people would place locations or pins on locations that of their perceived importance, and we had 15 value categories that they could choose from within coastal and marine areas. And so within the survey, you had place names such as cities and towns and rivers, but we did not include the marine reserve network in this. And in addition to the mapping exercise, participants were also encouraged to enter demographic information such as their home region and some other information about if they were willing to, and as well as the awareness and opinions about the Marine Reserve Program. So next. So of those 15 value categories, we broke them into 3 different value groups. And so the first group, use values, so you can go next, was further broken down into indirect use. And so these uses would be scenic and aesthetic values, not directly tangible uses, but more not really consumable, non-consumptive use is another word, I guess, used for this indirect use category. And then on the other side, direct uses. And so these are more traditional tangible uses such as fishing, logging, and even learning and education and tourism would be fell into this direct use category. And then on the other side, we had non-use values. And so these were existence values. And this is thought of as more intrinsic values. So they're biodiversity and wildlife, historic, social, these types of values that and wilderness that are not as tangible in terms of a use, but are more existence-based. So you can go next. And so once we collected this information across these value categories, we had developed an area of analyses to exclude pins that fell outside of these categories. And so marine pins that were outside of the US contiguous zone, which is 24 nautical miles from the coast, were excluded. And then similarly, land-based pins that were outside of Oregon's coastal zone, which is highlighted in blue, were also excluded from our analyses. You can go next. And so respondents who participated were broke down into regional groups in order to sort of do these regional analyses. And these groups were based on home region and zip code and roughly follow the county lines, except for down in the southern coast. But as you can see, coastal residents and then inland residents. And this was all determined based on the zip codes provided in their survey response. I guess go next here. So in terms of regional response, we had 244 total respondents, and we averaged 33 pins per person. So there was a wider range. Some people placed 1 or 2, and some people placed a lot more, but the average was 33. In our survey, coastal residents were overrepresented compared to statewide population averages. So you can see coastal respondents made up about 50% of total respondents compared to a much lower figure proportionally to the Oregon population. And I think this really highlights the salience of these types of topics to coastal residents, especially in a survey such as this, where it's a little bit more time consuming and involved. So you really have to engage with the survey. So anyway, coastal residents were a little more overrepresented than others throughout the state. You can go next. Oh. In terms of value pins and the types of values people chose to place in these different locations, indirect use pins were the most popular pin choice. And you can see here, these are categories included in this larger category are aesthetic and scenic values, recreation, non-motorized. So that would mean surfing, kayaking, walking on the beach. I guess beach recreation is the next value. So those types of values were by far across our entire survey the most popular categories. Non-use or existence pins were the second most commonly used. And these are, as you can see here, biodiversity and wildlife was the most popular, followed by wilderness and heritage and historic values, followed by social, intrinsic, and cultural values associated with these coastal areas. Finally, direct use was our third most popular value type, and this is more associated with tourism, learning and education, fishing, sport and charter fishing, as well as economic values associated with coastal resources. So this sort of is a breakdown of the types of values and the larger categories that they fall into across our entire survey. And so you can go next. So in order to kind of get at, so we have the regional information about where people are located, and then we have sort of these totals about which types of values they're associated with. We were curious about if different regions of the state had closer associations with different value types. And so we did what's called a correspondence analysis, which essentially accounts for the proportion of respondents in each of the locations, and gives you an indication of specific associations between regions in this case and specific value types. And so just as an example here, they're highlighted in the the oval colors, but you can see here that Southern and South Coast respondents, highlighted in the darker blue, were more likely, I suppose, to choose value pins such as economic, sport fishing, and motor vehicle use. In the North Coast, folks were more likely to choose heritage, wilderness, and cultural value types. And then, I guess in the other example would be in Eastern Oregon, special place and scenic were really the fewer people that were out there really were tied into those specific values. And so this just sort of gives us a glimpse into some of the value orientations and how they correspond with some of the regions of the state. And some of these fall into sort of general understandings about, I guess, different regions and how they really interact, such as, Portland and the PDX region, tourism, learning, and social were really high in their value orientations. So this gave us a little insight there. And then we were interested in looking at which regions or how regional differences in where pins were placed on the coast. So you can go to the next slide. So beyond the value types that we were looking at there, so we looked at how where respondents' home region was, how that translated to where on the coast they were visiting and or not necessarily visiting, but where they were placing value pins. And so we did density plots for each region that are displayed here. That's just off the coast is the violin plot you can see. And so what these really showed is that people were placing pins proximate to their home latitude. So if you can see just on the left side, then all the coastal residents, you can see as the North Coast respondents were placing more pins along the North Coast, Mid Coast along the Mid Coast, and South Coast along the South Coast. And so what this really highlights is either a travel and opportunity cost type scenario where people are visiting and therefore placing value into areas that are more accessible to them, more directly accessible, or just shows a familiarity. But that was interesting to kind of see from the data. And yeah, so closer to home essentially. So next we were interested in looking at how different value types were related to awareness and or support of the marine protected areas. And so plots A and B here are looking at awareness of the program. And we really didn't see very much change in the types of values people placed based on their awareness of the program. So we didn't really notice any differences there. But where we did notice some differences in value types was in people's sentiments around support and opposition of the Marine Reserve program. And so you can really see here in plot C that those strongly opposed were really placing very much majority direct use pins. It's almost 80% of the pins were direct use. And as the support for the Marine Reserve Program and Marine Protected Area Program increase, you can see a decrease in that direct use value category and an increase in existence and indirect uses. And so those are sort of displayed there by the sort of intersecting lines there as support increases. And then what's also notable about this that we thought it was interesting is that those that were unsure about how they felt really, by and large, were placing indirect use pins. So again, indirect uses, scenic aesthetic, things of that nature, and beach recreation, things like that. So you can really see where that information kind of came out. And I think that was all I really had to say about this one. So next. Finally, looking at within the marine reserves and marine protected areas, we noticed, or we found that, so what we did is we took the all the pins within the territorial sea, which, as Max mentioned earlier, is around 91% of the coast. It's the first 3 miles. And then within the marine reserve, and we compared that to pins that were placed within the marine reserve. And one thing that's interesting, notable, is that there was about 20% of the pins within the territorial sea were placed within the marine reserves. And so that's about twice as big as the average area of the reserve. So that's interesting. Also, in terms of value types, we found that existence values were really elevated above the coastwide averages. We can see by around 7% higher chance of placing existence pins. So those are wilderness, biodiversity, and wildlife pins placing within the marine reserves compared to the rest of the coast. And also, as you can kind of see in this map, and I have another one coming up next, but value clusters and where people chose to place pins within these areas, you can see they really correspond with certain features within each and around each of the marine reserves. And we didn't do any further analysis on that, but I think it is really notable and interesting. And so you can kind of go to the next slide, and since we're here talking about Cape Perpetua, I thought I would make one just for that. And so you can really see how the pins are clustered around certain areas. Obviously, Cape Perpetua is a major attractive spot and a lot of activity in the near shore and in the intertidal zone. Same with down by Heceta Head. And so you can see sort of increased clusters of value pins in those locations, which was really interesting to observe. And within the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve, we found that aesthetic and scenic values were the most pinned category, and also the largest deviation from the coastwide averages. And so let's see if I have anything else. I guess with that, we'll go on to sort of a conclusion discussion about this. So you can go next. And so ultimately, kind of what we found that was interesting to us was that in terms of connections between the types of values that people place and where they live in the state, more accessible and or closer areas seem to receive a larger proportion of pins, which make sense. This also sort of those value association, or those regional associations with different value types really highlights that there are opportunities to engage with user groups and how geography may play a role in what types of values might be more effective in targeting for engagement with different groups in different parts of the state. We also, in terms of marine reserves and marine protected areas, it was interesting to observe that the existence values were highlighted in those areas compared to other areas, and that that really kind of highlights some of the rationale for their preservation, and at least supports that those designations as biodiversity, wildlife, wilderness hotspots, at least in terms of the people surveyed in this survey. And then just a final note here is that I think this survey was really interesting to see the spatial configuration of values in the marine and nearshore areas. And ultimately, PPGIS is the participatory mapping that we use is a very useful and somewhat underutilized tool that has many applications. And so, I think that would be just sort of quick promotion on that sort of method. I think it's really interesting, especially as people are more familiar with mapping interfaces and placing locations. I think it's a good way to gain information about these areas that are important. So with that, I guess I'll turn it back to Max or open it up to if there are any questions. And yeah.
Thank you so much, you guys. It's very interesting research. We have one question come in, but if any of the audience members have any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat or the Q&A box. One question I like to ask the presenters is what kind of was the inspiration or the aha or the push to do a little more research in this area?
Well, I mean, I think that's a great question, Tara. I mean, I think the inspiration or the push to do this is to do the work that both Kaegan and I presented is somewhat, maybe, I don't know how to say this, is it's related to the way the state of Oregon set up the Marine Reserve System, which was to let's start with this initial set of marine reserves that were designated in the roughly 2012 to 2015 or 16 timeframe, and let's implement them for a decade, and then let's do some evaluation and see what they what we've learned about them. How have they worked? How have the stakeholders in these in the designation of these different marine reserves and protected areas, how have they perceived the outcomes, and what have the real sort of biological and ecological and oceanographic outcomes been? And so the state, I think, has really and from my personal perspective, thankfully, has put in a lot of effort to try and help better understand the outcomes of the public policy that they've implemented. And so the work that we've done and that both Kaegan and I have presented here is really in service towards that goal of really, I think, and just to kind of plug the term that I use, but in service of that goal of ensuring that the marine reserves and protected areas that we have really do serve the public trust, so that they can be sustainable in the long run as a public policy. And if we found, for example, that they really didn't serve, or they didn't have broad public support, or they had some really major constituencies of users that were seriously concerned, that would really challenge their sustainability as a public policy program for the long term. And I think so that's, from my perspective, is where the impetus to do this kind of work did, and I'm grateful to Sea Grant as well as to the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife for helping support us in doing this work. Yeah, I don't know, Kaegan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just, I agree, and I think especially it's very doing understanding ecological value and the value of these natural resources in a very tangible and more direct way is very commonplace, trying to do monitoring and understand yield or fishing opportunity, things like that. But I do think that capturing sort of the human dimensions of these ecosystems and how people value them really provides just another layer of information to kind of add to sort of these decision-making bodies when you're sort of trying to think about, well, what are the benefits of this area? Just having another layer, this sort of human dimension piece to add in, and having tangible data collected through surveys or whatever methods you use, I think really just helps to inform people making decisions about coastal resources. So I think that's sort of what I think is what I like about this type of research, and I think it's important.
Very nice. We have a question. They would like to see a copy of the survey. So one, is there a link or somewhere where somebody can see the survey? And then the second part of that question is, what were the questions that indicated each resource use type?
Yeah, so the short answer, I think, on the first part of that question about somewhere to see the survey is yes. So the trick would be how to communicate it to you. But I suppose I could share with you, Tara, a link that would take somebody to it. Basically, I think the link that I would give you is our library, the Portland State University Library archives, student research and publications, and so there's a link somewhere to all the information that we presented here that I will share with Tara and make sure it gets shared out with you guys.
Perfect.
As far as the second part of that question, what were the questions that indicated each resource use type?
Yes.
Is that maybe pointed towards Kaegan, or was that towards the telephone survey that I talked about? I'm not sure.
They did not clarify.
Well, I could just say, in the survey that I talked about, which was a telephone survey, they had to be pretty simple, right? Because we're just on the phone with people, essentially interviewing them in a structured way. So we asked about support and opposition to things like, say an item would be, please indicate how much you support or oppose, commercial fishing as a use of Oregon's territorial sea. How much do you support or oppose the development of wind farms as a use of Oregon's territorial sea? So those were the types of ways those questions were asked. And when I share that link with you, you can see more specifically.
The surveys can get so complex, I know, just from when we did our intercept survey here.
Well, yeah,
Okay,
and the
so-
devil's in the details, right?
Totally
So,
in the details.
Yeah.
How did you convey the information that there's a very small economic impact to the fishing fleet, approximately 1 to 2%, insignificant, and can you discuss benefits of achieving goal 19, which is Oregon State Goal 19?
I can take part of this, Kaegan, if, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to know how we compare in the mapping survey. I don't know if we got into that.
So I guess two ways to think about the answer to this question, at least the first part of it about conveying information that there's a very small economic impact. We didn't try to convey whether there was an economic impact or not an economic impact in the telephone survey. What we were interested in were people's perceptions about it. I personally feel like surveys are a pretty poor tool for educating people about issues. And so, an effort to try and communicate, what we think is the right answer. I was more interested in their own perceptions of what the impacts were rather than the other way around. The flip side of that, though, to answer Paul's question, is that we did have another student and another piece of research that was really focused on the economic impact of the marine reserves, where we worked, and Bryn Hudson, who I mentioned at the very beginning, worked with fishers across several different fisheries in the nearshore to really understand their fishing behavior over time, particularly before, during, and after the implementation of the marine reserves, as well as and therefore what the economic impacts were, as well as sort of their business strategy, with regards to their fishing permits. And the idea there was really to better understand what as best we could from looking at the data from the fishers themselves, what the economic impacts were. And I think, if I was to, sum up that in a very, pithy comment, it would be roughly, Paul, what you wrote here. It was a very small impact, if any, and particularly, it's even hard to generalize and say that there was even a small impact. It was with a very few, specific fishers who indicated some sort of impact, typically because their fishing grounds in a very small number of cases tended to overlap with where the marine reserves were.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any recommendations for environmental education, like what to teach, where to target, those types of things that you learned from maybe this survey?
Kaegan, do you want to
Well,
take some of that? I've been talking a lot.
One of the interesting things, and we could go back to that regional value association is sort of as I don't know if this is how strongly you could recommend this, but it was interesting to see sort of how different people in different parts of the state maybe value these coastal resources. So I think taking some information there could really inform sort of a regional strategy for understanding. I mean, and granted, it's a small population size of survey respondents, but in terms of targeting people and ways to engage with coastal and marine resource management, that might be sort of an inroad, or at least a first step in trying to kind of get some of that information. So, South Coast respondents in the Southern Oregon and South Coast were more interested in economic values and fishing values, historic and heritage more in the North Coast, in the learning and education up in the Portland metro area. So I don't know, that's very broad answer. Like, I don't know specifically, but I do think that engaging different people in different parts of the state differently based on sort of how they might connect with the coast would be good to think about for those kind of communication strategies.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I could add to that too, I think, another interesting observation from the telephone survey that we did and the model that we created on it was that, you'll remember I talked about these sort of two concerns that people had about threats to the, to the ocean, and they roughly grouped into what we described as ecological integrity concerns and environmental quality concerns. Well, those ecological integrity concerns, habitat, what were some of the rest of them? Oh boy, now of course I'm on the spot and I'm blanking, but those ecological integrity concerns were actually fairly strongly associated with whether or not people said they were willing to vote to support and expand the marine reserve system that we have. And, from that perspective, I would just say then from an looking at environmental education, the more people know and understand about what the threats are to the ocean, I think the more they were supportive of this, the type of work that the marine reserves set out to accomplish. The flip side of that, I think, was interesting, was that we really found no relationship between those environmental quality concerns that people had and the marine reserves. And I think there's some logic behind that, in that the marine reserves don't necessarily, avoid environmental quality degradation, things like marine debris and pollution. Whereas they do have impacts, or at least we think they do have impacts on the ecological integrity and the habitat that's occurring within the zones of the marine reserves. So there was some, I think, logical consistency in what people told us there.
Mm-hmm. And then one last question. Did either of you get surprised, or were you like, oh, I did not think that this is the outcome that we would see with either bits of your research?
Well, surprise. Oh, go ahead, Kaegan.
Oh, I was gonna say, I didn't really know exactly what to expect. But in a lot of senses, it sort of confirmed notions that already sort of existed in my at least regional understanding of how people would use coastal resources and or value them. So I guess it was more confirmation of some things than totally surprising. But yeah, I guess I didn't really know what to expect to be on the onset. So,
Mhm.
so
Yeah, I think, in some senses, the work I reported on, it's sort of, it confirms what we probably already suspected or we thought we knew. And sometimes I find that to be the outcome of my work, is like we're telling a story that we sort of think we know already, but now we're providing data to back it up. And so I think from that perspective, not too surprising. One spot where I was surprised, though, and this is a great question, because one spot where I was surprised was when we looked at the model that we created. You'll remember there were some little asterisks I highlighted to indicate things where there was some like funny variability. And so one of those variables that had that variability in it was, people's self-report of how informed they were about the marine reserves. And while on average, the more informed you were about marine reserves, the more likely you were to support them, there was also the indication within that variability piece that there are some people for whom they feel really well informed and therefore they passionately disagree. And so that was a little bit of a surprise to me that I think I hadn't expected. But of course, hindsight, you look back and you're like, oh yeah, of course, right? Like we all see what we want to see.
Yeah. So I said that was the last question, but one more trickled in and it's a good one. So I want to throw it out there real fast. How much did people link ocean and coastal resource value to terrestrial resource value?
I imagine you're talking about in the mapping exercise there. And this is one of the questions that we didn't get to in this analysis that I think is a very important one, especially in kind of documenting that relationship that is clearly there between the coast and the near shore, and we, especially in the marine protected area, there's sort of this terrestrial component of where people are visiting and how those resources connect with the coastal ones. I think is a great question. We didn't analyze it in this analysis, but so I don't. The question is, I guess I don't know, but I imagine there's a connection. It's a really good question.
Maybe version 2.0.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Max and Kaegan, for joining us. Really appreciate you participating in the series. Really great research, and excited to see like what comes of marine reserves in Oregon as time goes on. And thank you everybody for joining us as well. I hope you all have a wonderful week or 2 or 3 and a good holiday season. And with that, have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.